think next year, tell us what you really think. Jonathan, yes. Sure.
So we're going. I just want to make two brief economist comments, and a third non-economist one. The first one's my non-economist comment. Forge, you're crazy. My real two economist comments on the presentation. The very interesting presentation, I must say. What I want to say first is what does no market power mean for an economist? And if I say there's no market power, what I have in mind is that essentially a free entry equilibrium, which means that in a situation where marginal cost is rising, it's going to be marginal cost pricing, but in a setting in which the marginal cost is falling or constant, price would have to be above the marginal cost. It would presumably be the average cost of an efficient engine, whether we saw the entrant or not. And I think there was some conflating of the different kinds of cost structures that in the conversation George was giving us. And my second economist comment is that I am quite confident that Congress did not say that competition means that you have any industry with an HHI of less than 7,450. And surely that's not what the antitrust agency said.
Well, that's what the statute says. And they define it effective competition. Now we can argue whether or not, in an antitrust sense, but antitrust is I think Tim made clear. Antitrust is not regulation. I mean, an antitrust guy says, okay, you can or you can't combine, and that's the decision. It's one or the other. In some cases, I guess it's, oh, well, you get rid of that, get rid of this, and everything will be okay. Regulation is different than that. The regulator comes in and becomes a participant in ongoing economic exchange. I said price, quality, or whatever it is. Okay. And by the way, Jonathan, it's absolutely correct. It depends on the nature of cost. Okay, how you write up marginal cost. And in the paper that I've discussed, where I discuss this, and this will be coming out in a written statement that you all can read. That point is made clear. I mean, the assumption is of increasing returns, which is generally the assumption that we're dealing with in telecommunications.
We're running really over time. Should we take, do we have time for a few questions?
I build time, I'm used to this, I build time into the schedule.
Oh, okay, very good.
Now we know.
Yes.
Chuck O'Connor, CRS. George, I do want to respond a little when you're talking about the 92 Cable Act. You're looking at just one part of the act that had to do with retail price regulation. And there was also program access requirements built in there. There was retransmission consent. So there were a lot of regulations that had to do, especially with vertical situations. So I think if you're only looking at one part of it, you're really being misleading as to what Congress is doing.
Well, I agree, but you're in a slightly different, you're moving to a level. How do you define effective competition when you have 10,000 monopolies at a level of buying power in the programming market? The programming market is a different market, okay? And Congress didn't say, as the FCC has learned, in its many attempts to try to regulate the ownership of cable systems, the Congress didn't say anything about that. That's a different problem. Okay? But the question is, in telecom, you got a cable system, which is a facilities-based wireline network that runs down the street and goes into people's houses. And Congress said that if there's half a competitor, the FCC, get out. That's what the statute.
But it also said there were program access requirements, and when you're vertically integrated and you have control of programming, then you may have to make that programming available. And you have the AT&T and Verizon, who on one side of the case where it has to do with making their network available, screening all the TV, and on this side they're saying, oh yeah, we should, as new entrants into video, we should have access to the programming of the Comcast. So that was a built-in.
There are many markets. There are many markets that the Cable Act addresses. Many. Okay. There's only one market where the FCC defines effective, or the Congress defines effective competition. Only one, and that's the one that I mentioned, and that is the price regulation of the local franchise cable system. Now, the accumulation of them in the form of MSOs and the purchase of programming by a monopsony or whatever that Congress was contemplating is a different question. It's a different market for which effective competition was not defined.
I just want to, I think it's easy to kind of, lose sight of what the argument is, to make it sound like if there's not effective competition, whatever that is, then you regulate whatever that is. It ought to be, I mean, just to give a couple of examples, it's not hard to come up with, I mean, I thought the point about, but I'll agree with a lot of what George said, that the idea that you know, that asking, well, what more can authorities do beyond a Nash equilibrium? Well, if the Nash equilibrium is a really very high price outcome, in principle, you know, an omniscient, wise regulator might be able to do better. It's not impossible to do better even if you have a zero profit equilibrium, if you have too many firms in it. I think somebody raised that question earlier. The question isn't effective competition versus regulation, it's whether can regulation improve matters upon whatever it is you happen to have. And if you want to call it effective competition, you want to call it a banana, you want to call it whatever you want, it doesn't really matter. The issue is whether you think that someone can write the order or come out with a better outcome. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. As I said earlier, it's sort of drilled into me that if it's more than one, you're probably not going to do better because regulation just doesn't work very well. And that's really what this is about. But just because I think that doesn't mean that that's right. And so there is this interesting question on the table, but it is an empirical one, and being hung up on how we define effective competition as the standard, and saying if it's not effective competition, or if you have a zero profit equilibrium, well, does that mean if you have a positive profit equilibrium you should regulate? I don't think that's what anybody, well, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but that's really not the question. The question is whether could regulation do better. You know, my gut level is that it's hard to expect that, but you know, maybe it's an open question.
Yeah, one brief comment, which is I think the question was really on the right track here. Just because Congress 20 years ago defines effective competition for one purpose doesn't mean that whenever you have an industry that has more than 1.5 firms, that we should never regulate anything ever, which was, I think, the implication that was being suggested.
Actually, they still regulate the prices of the set-top boxes in that case, so it's not a complete elimination of regulation. There is some residual, and regulation coming to many more industries in that form, apparently, in the future. We'll talk about that next year.
Time for one more question.
Somebody have one more question?
One more question.
He's had his question.
Okay, so the theme of the conference was on jobs, and
That's not true.
So I'm going to try and build that bridge just from something that George, you provoked, but I would certainly be interested in John, your comments, and Tim's as well. If you think about that simple presentation of a Bertrand oligopoly with capacity constraints, and the role of capacity constraints is really quite important in both intuitively and in those models in possibly elevating prices to unpalatable levels. So the question that I might ask is whether at this particular moment there is a role motivated by Bertrand competition with capacity constraints in adopting policies, or at least thinking about policies that enable firms to invest and grow, to remove capacity constraints in a sense, to ensure that even if you have a relatively small number of competitors, that they compete as pure, unconstrained Bertrand oligopolists. And I'm sorry, that was a sort of technical question to a bunch of economists, but it has to do with jobs.
I think we could probably all agree that in general, finding ways to facilitate entry and expansion by firms is a good thing for competition and for investment and for job creation. And so as a general answer, I think it is yes.
But then you have all the literature where firms, monopolists would use excess capacity to deter entry. I don't know if in antitrust they still think about those papers, but that, as a counter, just to be devil's advocate, you can go that route too. But let's just, my view is that we should ban the use of backhoes so that all telecommunications infrastructure has to be dug with shovels, and therefore we would much increase labor in the industry. That's my approach.
And entrench the monopolists. So,
If it makes more jobs, then it's okay with me.
Well, to tie up the nexus here with the subject of the panel, which has been, I think, a very lively discussion of competition policy, I can tell you from the beginning, the earliest days of the Economist at the Commission going back to the mid-70s, one of the major arguments that we would make at that point in opposition to the Bell system, arguing for entry, was that competition was not a zero-sum game, that it wasn't a matter of just letting more people come in, divide up a fixed pie, but in fact, the very process of entry would in fact grow the market, would grow the pie, would in fact lead to more investment, more jobs, more variety, more choice, and maybe even lower prices and better products. So the nexus has always been there. So we were right and consistent with the theme. Let's give a hand to our panel and move on. Thank you.